Okay, so Mikhail Botvinnik. We did this Life in Chess series for, 14 or 15 installments. And then we focused on the candidates in the lead up to the candidates tournament. And obviously that is now planned between Sergei Karyakin and Magnus Carlsen in November in New York. The venues have been announced. So if you're ever thinking about taking a little trip to New York in November, you could maybe watch some games. And then we came back to the Life in Chess series after we finished with the candidates because people said, oh, you should have had a lecture about Emanuel Lasker. So, okay, yeah, you're right. We should really have a lecture about Emanuel Lasker. And then people said, and just by the way, I'm Lucas Anderson. I'm a librarian most of the time. And Warren is a computer scientist, but one of the strongest chess players around. And we co-present this in the way that I present the history part, which plays to my strength, and he analyzes the games tonight. So we did a Soviet School of Chess lecture over 2 years ago in 2014, and people said, well, you should do Botvinnik, and I said, well, I covered him in the Soviet School of Chess. Look, I had a whole slide on Mikhail Botvinnik. And people said, yeah, but you should really have a full lecture on Botvinnik. And that was one thing that we heard commonly, in YouTube comments, for example. And then I also heard this third blurb is actually from a university professor who emailed me and pointed out inaccuracies in the presentation, which actually I appreciate. He is a professional historian to my amateur historian, so I appreciate his commentary. So I thought, okay, yes, we do need to have a lecture on Botvinnik, A, because he deserves his own lecture, let's be frank, and B, because there are some things that I would like to rectify in the presentation. And so I'm going to try to do that tonight. And also because Botvinnik is worthy of study. There's a quote from Andy Soltis that says, Botvinnik was born under a monarchy. He was born under Tsar Peter II back in 1911. That he lived through a revolution, that'd be the Bolshevik Revolution, a civil war, the brutal collectivization and famine, that was in the 20s, the terror, that was actually in the 30s, the Stalinist purges, a second World War, yes, with the siege of Leningrad, which is covered in the Soviet School of Chess lecture, a Cold War, the end of Stalin, and Khrushchev and his apologies and saying, okay, we really messed up under Stalin. Then the Gorbachev reforms of the 80s, and then the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And through all of this, and there were times where Botvinnik's influence waned a little bit, but through all of this, Botvinnik survived, which is something that a lot of people couldn't say from World War II and the purges and all that, but he thrived. And how he did that is worthy of evaluation. So I've got this quote from Andrew Soltis, and the book that I took it from is called Mikhail Botvinnik, The Life and Games of a World Chess Champion. And if you're going to buy one book on Mikhail Botvinnik, this would be the one for a couple of reasons. One, it's published by McFarlane and Company. And if you recall, or if you were here for the Arun Nimzovich lecture, I used a book from McFarlane and Company, and I found it amazing. And the Soviet School of Chess book that I used from Andy Soltis was also published by McFarlane and Company. And as a librarian, I have to say, the bindings of their books and the layouts, the spines and the gutters and everything, it's really exquisite. They really produce a quality book. So you do pay a premium. It is a lot more costly than, say, a paperback, but it's going to be a book that you're going to be able to keep in, near perfect condition for probably the rest of your life. So Botvinnik is a fascinating figure. He's lived through a lot, but as I usually do, let me tell you a little bit about his childhood. So Botvinnik was born Mikhail Moisevich Botvinnik. Family called him Misha, or some people called him Michel, particularly those that spoke Hebrew. And then later on, he became known as, everybody calls him the patriarch of Soviet chess for the reasons we'll get into. He was born in the Russian Empire, but actually when he was born in 1911, he was born in what we would now consider a suburb of St. Petersburg, but it was like 20, 30 miles from downtown St. Petersburg, and it was actually part of the Grand Duchy of Finland. For a while, it belonged to Finland until the Winter War, right before World War II, where Russia invaded in the promise of, well, better defending St. Petersburg essentially from the Nazis by cutting off another route from the north, but we'll get into that. So Botvinnik was the child of parents that were Jewish. Both of them were Jewish. That's one thing we should note. That fact is going to come up on and on again throughout the remainder of his life as people question if he was really a Russian, at least members of the Soviet Central Committee, because his parents were Jewish. And also because his parents were considered middle class. They were members of the bourgeoisie, that fancy French term for people that live in the middle class, as opposed to being workers. They were not factory workers. His dad was a dental technician, and his mom was a dentist. Now, by our standards, those aren't necessarily glamorous professions, but they did allow young Mikhail Botvinnik and his family to live in some measure of comfort. They had a large apartment with several rooms in St. Petersburg. They ate well, they had clothing, and that was a pretty important thing. Incidentally, Botvinnik's father was he was active politically, and a lot of his siblings, brothers and sisters who escaped persecution, actually immigrated to the United States. So there may be some Botvinniks running around in the U.S. that can trace their ancestry to Botvinnik's father, essentially. Their dad may have been, or Botvinnik's dad may have been their uncle, for example. So he has an older brother. His older brother is named Isaac, or Isya, as he was called by the family. And he was Botvinnik's role model. Mikhail Botvinnik really looked up to his older brother. Talks about him a lot. Talks about how hard he worked, how he was a tram worker, and how he tried to serve his country during the war, and how he was such a positive influence on him, how he took care of him when his dad left the family later on. He had a younger sister named Maria, and in all of Botvinnik's books and writings, she gets just a few sentences here and there, and that's it. So we don't hear very much about her. We hear about his older brother, but not necessarily his sister. I mentioned the father left the family. Understand that in 1919, 1921, or 1918, 1919, the families really didn't have much to eat. There was a revolution going on, the Bolshevik Revolution. There was essentially a civil war going on, and they went from a very bourgeois upbringing to having basically nothing, because what happened is Botvinnik's mom stopped working when they got married, and then she got ill in around 1920. The father left and married a woman who was more well off, and basically gave the family some sort of alimony / child support, but not very much. So they ate a lot of, he calls it sauerkraut soup, a lot of cabbage soup, fermented cabbage soup. They didn't have changes of clothes, that sort of thing, and supplies were really limited in this time too. So that certainly makes it pretty hard. So his life had some measure of hardship. And this is going to stick with Botvinnik for the rest of his life. There's a story in the Soltis book later on about how Botvinnik is at his summer house and he has a grandmaster over to help him train, and that grandmaster is used to eating hearty breakfasts of eggs and maybe even waking up in the middle of the night and making himself another meal. And at Botvinnik's house, that's not how things happen. Breakfast is porridge on a plate. And this grandmaster, after about a week, kind of went nuts and left because he just couldn't take it anymore. It was just, the lifestyle was too austere, it was too Spartan for him. But Botvinnik really kept this, he was regimented. Oh my goodness, was he regimented. And this really started out of necessity in his childhood. And that's important for us to understand. Also important for us to understand that he started chess at age 12. Think about that. He started playing chess at age 12 against, incidentally, the wishes of his parents. They didn't want him to play chess. And he quickly became one of the best chess players in the Soviet Union. In about 3 or 4 years, he achieved that goal, and we'll see that progression in a moment. And he thought, because Botvinnik was convinced that whatever worked for him was the right thing, 100%. His daughter, he had a daughter named Olga, his daughter asked him, to teach her how to play chess. And he refused, saying, you have to wait till you're 12. Because it worked for him, gosh darn it. So it's right for everybody. I wonder, we just had Jeffrey Zhang win the World Youth Open, right? And he's 15, and I'm sure he probably started chess around 5 or something. I wonder how someone like that would react. It's interesting to kind of compare, because nowadays, and we saw this even going back to like Karpov and even Capablanca, who started around age 4. There's so many other players who were world champions that started very early. Botvinnik is a big exception, and perhaps a source of inspiration as well. So I mentioned that he enjoyed some early successes, but I want to tell you a little bit more about his character. Botvinnik he held a grudge. Oh my goodness, did he hold a grudge. I told you a story in the Soviet School of Chess lecture that if someone annoyed him, like on the phone, he would say to the person on the phone, what is the date today? And they'd say, oh, today's the 23rd of May. He said, then I'll speak to you after the 23rd of May next year, and he'd hang up. Well, that started early. In 1924, he was annoyed by one of his opponents, a deaf and dumb artist by the name of Folga, who really, he wanted to torture me, he had something against me. And one day when Botvinnik was in a clearly winning position, he reached over and grabbed Folga's king and laid it down on the board, which is obviously a big no-no, right? We all know that too. But Botvinnik was so upset, with him that's what he did. And this is an important aspect of Botvinnik's personality that's going to stick for the rest of his life. For Botvinnik, there were two types of chess players. There were chess players that made friends with their opponent. They were their partner in some sort of realization of an art. And there are people like this, like Bronstein, Spassky, Geller, Karras. I mean, let's be honest. Spassky could have told Fischer in the 1972 World Championship, of course I'm not agreeing to play in the table tennis room. Get over it, or I'm going to have you forfeited. And he would have been perfectly within his rights to do that, but he didn't. Well, Botvinnik was not in that camp. He was in the camp of a Nimzovich or an Alekhine or a Kasparov, or perhaps even a Nakamura. Someone who had to vilify his opponent. He had to get riled up and angry at his opponent. Now, why do I mention that now? Because it has ramifications for the rest of his career. Think about how many times he lost his title and came back and won it the following year. Someone caught him off guard, fine. Maybe he wasn't practicing enough, but by gosh, he was going to go home, he was going to work his butt off, and he's going to come back in the return match and kick their butts. That's how he worked. And he had quite a measure of success with it. So I mentioned he had a lot of early success, that he was able to really impress the establishment in St. Petersburg. At the time, it's called Leningrad. It was renamed in Lenin's honor after the Bolshevik Revolution. Before that, it was called Petrograd. So Petrograd, Leningrad, St. Petersburg. So he was able to make an impression, and he got some opportunities, and when he got the opportunities, he made the most of them. In particular, in 1925, at the tender age of 14 years old, after he's been playing for 2 years, Botvinnik sits down at a simul and plays none other than Capablanca, the world champion at the time. Capablanca, who hardly ever loses a game. I mean, think about it, he went like 8 years unbeaten in a tournament game, right? And Botvinnik beats him. Granted, it's a simul, okay? We shouldn't read too much into that, but he beat Capablanca, right? And he's 14 years old. And he reached a position like this. Capablanca has just played c6. A lot of threats there. Take a moment, analyze this position, and just tell me what you think Botvinnik played. Before we talk about what Botvinnik would play, I'm curious, what move leaps out to you? What would you want to play in this position as black?
I would presume most people would just want to play b takes c6 just to recapture.
I mean, that's the first move that jumps out at me. B takes c6. He's pushing c6, b takes, and we end that threat. I mean, to me, I would assume that someone like Capablanca would have some sort of scary idea behind that, and if I didn't react to it, I'd be in trouble. But Botvinnik is cool as a cucumber, even at age 14. What did he play? Guesses? I'm not saying it's like the best move, engine move. I don't know. I didn't actually put it into an engine.
takes c3, you open up a c5.
That's what he played, bishop takes c3. I mean, you have to be pretty confident in your ability to calculate to be able to play a move like that against the world, at least I think. So play continued from here, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3. Didn't trade queens, he played queen takes a2. Bishop d3, then b takes c6. And then Capablanca plays this ugly king c2 move. And then Botvinnik continues with c5, and black just has a pleasant game, and Botvinnik won a rook game against one of the best endgame players of all time. And this really surprised people. There were some headlines in some newspapers at this. And after this, Botvinnik got a sponsor, and Yakov Roklin. And this is important. In the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution, things really worked by this system of favors and sponsors and connections. And the people that you knew and could advocate on your behalf, that determined your ability to succeed. And frankly, having someone advocating on your behalf is a pretty big deal at this time, particularly for a 14-year-old boy with no connections otherwise. He's just like a kid in school. But now he's got the attention of the regime. At the time, he didn't have a coach. The most famous player in Leningrad at the time is Peter Romanovsky. And Romanovsky won quite a few tournaments, and he had a school with all the talented youth of the city going. And even though and he had a club that he sponsored, and Botvinnik actually went to a different club that was further from home because he didn't want to go to Romanovsky's club. It's interesting, but Botvinnik was going to do things his own way. He was very independent. And Romanovsky, yes, he didn't like Botvinnik, and a lot of people didn't like Botvinnik. And you'll see later on, he was one of those guys, you either loved him or hated him. There wasn't much in between. And he had enemies, and Romanovsky was an early one who advocated against him in certain situations. In 1926, there was a Leningrad City Championship. Botvinnik is 15 years old. 1,200 players participate. You have people like Alexander Ilyin Genevsky, who won the tournament incidentally. You have Levenfish, Romanovsky himself, and 1,200 other players, and this 15-year-old kid ties for second. This was a big deal, right? As a result of this, he was selected to participate on a team from Leningrad to actually travel to Stockholm. His mom, incidentally, was against this. She went to the director of the school and she said, I don't think my son should go abroad and play in a tournament and miss 2 weeks of school. And the director of the school basically said, yeah, he's a good kid, he gets good grades, and this is an opportunity for him to see the world, let him go. This was one of a couple of instances where his mom went to the head of the school trying to get him to intervene, and he refused. He went to Stockholm November 6th to 7th, 1926. This was his first time out of the country, and it was pretty surprising to send a 15-year-old kid to represent Leningrad in the Soviet Union, but he did fairly well. He didn't embarrass himself. He was a good representative. And incidentally, Botvinnik says, and he didn't reveal this until way later, he actually considered defecting on this trip. He considered asking for asylum in Sweden and staying and not returning home to his family. Later on, when people would ask his advice about whether they should defect or not, he'd say, well, I had the chance in Stockholm, but I didn't, and it worked out just fine for me, because anything that worked for him was obviously the right thing to do. So defecting, because he had chosen not to this one time, was obviously the wrong thing. And here's what Botvinnik said about Romanovsky, which I think is telling. He says, Romanovsky's attitude to me, just as was the case with the whole of the older generation, was one of jealousy and no particular goodwill. Before my appearance, Romanovsky and his contemporaries held undisputed sway, and suddenly this upstart appeared. Of course, he was the upstart, around to shake up the establishment. Well, he did need some help, and one of his early helpers was Abram Model. Model was a master-level player himself. In the 1927 USSR Championship, Botvinnik is 16 years old. Model and Botvinnik shared a hotel room, and they would analyze games together. And Botvinnik is famous for his analysis. If you say nothing else about Mikhail Botvinnik, his commitment and his ability to analyze games, at least in that era, was unparalleled. But he really credits Abram Modell for instilling that, for teaching him how to do that. And he also really thanked him. They played a game, they played head-to-head in this tournament. And after the game, Modell took the time to teach him. Say, well, we played a French, and here's where you went wrong, and here are different lines, and really worked with him one-on-one. And Botvinnik remembered that. And he had some helpers along the way, certainly. And he helped other people along the way, too. He was a teacher in his own right, which we'll get to. And one thing you should know is that Botvinnik was not initially invited to this tournament. People pulled strings on his behalf to get him invited, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do, let's look at a couple of games. We're going to look at 5 games tonight. Warren's going to walk you through them, and we'll start with a few from later in Botvinnik's career.
So the first game I'm going to cover is his game against Alekhine in the Avro tournament in 1938. What was remarkable about this game was a couple things. First of all, was one of Alekhine's comments after the game. So Alekhine commented that, among every game he played at this tournament, which I think it was 8-player double round robin, so he played 14 games. He said this was the only one where he felt he was outplayed, which says a lot. And especially if you know anything about Alekhine, it's not very often he would admit to being outplayed. Most of the time when he lost, he would say, "Oh, I blundered here. If I just played differently there, I would have won." But he had no such comment for this game. It was just simple admission that he was outplayed. It was also significant because this was the first time that Botvinnik defeated a world champion in a regular game, right? Not a simul. So this was, a huge sign of arrival for Botvinnik. So far we have a pretty simple opening. As white, Botvinnik was a very solid player. He oftentimes played the English as well as white, and I'll get into that later. And as black, though, Botvinnik usually preferred something more complicated, actually. And I didn't pick any games where he was black, but I'll talk about some of his opening contributions later. So now Alekhine makes kind of his first slip. So he takes on d4, and it gives white this active, isolated queen pawn position. It's certainly playable for black, but Botvinnik remarked that he thought knight f6 was simpler, transposing to a queen's gambit accepted kind of position, right? By refraining from taking on d4, black keeps this bishop on c1 kind of out of the scene, right? But Alekhine decided to take. And now black has kind of a quandary of how to develop, right? Black only really has one bad piece, and that's that bishop on c8. It's not easy to find an active role. Now he chose b6, but as we'll see, this turns out to be a weakening that kind of plagues black later. It turns out if you're going to play this position as black, your best bet is actually in the move a6. It may seem strange to waste a tempo with this move, but it'll become evident later in this game, actually pretty soon, why you might want to have played a6. Right? And black's idea, of course, is to follow up with b5 and bishop b7 to activate the bishop. Or if white takes on d5, at least it'll get rid of the bishop. But Alekhine tried b6, and now Botvinnik captured, and now bishop b5. So not only does this make b6 a wasted move, since if black could, he would rather take back his move b6 because this knight on c6 is no longer stable. So that e5 square is an awfully good destination for white's knight. And it's not easy to defend the knight either, because after bishop d7, Botvinnik just piled up on it with queen a4. And now Alekhine had to retreat, because if you play rook c8, you lose the pawn on a7. All right, the rook on e1 turns out to be critical here, because after takes, the queen is not trapped because you can take that bishop. Right. So unfortunately, developing the knight naturally isn't possible, so black has to retreat. But now this knight on b8 is going to be a permanently bad piece, and it's really nice to see how Botvinnik plays against it. So first, he continues development with bishop f4. And Alekhine plays a6 because there's no other way to extricate that knight. You can't develop it to d7 because of the d5 pawn is going to fall. So a6 is necessary. And now queen a4. Queen a4 is a really important move. I know a lot of players who would instinctually just play queen b3, thinking that it's important to put pressure on d5. But that would allow knight c6. So the knight would emerge, and now if you play something like rook c1, black can play knight a5 or rook c8 to defend the knight. It'll be okay. So queen a4 is a really nice move. The point being to keep that knight from developing. And now bishop d6. It's absolutely essential for not only black to get that piece off the e-file, but to keep it defended. b5 would just weaken black's pawn structure further. If b5, by the way, what should white play here?
Queen c2.
Exactly, yeah. Being consistent, right? Again, we want to keep that knight from developing. Right? And it's hard for black to even develop it on d7 here because of bishop c7. And after queen e8, he's in a very difficult situation since that bishop's pinned, right? Bishop d6, and black is in serious trouble. So bishop d6, but now takes, and think like Botvinnik here. So how should white continue to restrict that knight on b8? I don't think he played knight e5. The reason is that you can play f6, I believe. And after the knight retreats, I'm guessing d3 or f3, then the knight can come out to c6. See, the point of rook c1 is that it prevents that knight from developing to c6. And, again, knight b7 would be far too passive. White could play rook c6 and exile the queen to b8, or queen c6 is also active. So rook a7. Black would like to play rook c7, and then the knight can come out to c6. So queen c2, preventing rook c7. Again, just iron logic, I would call it. White's playing against that knight on b8. Rook e7. Again, it's not a good idea for black to play knight d7. White will again have queen c6 and just have total dominance over that c-file. But now queen c7. And the point of this move was to prevent knight d7. And white continues to have this knight on b8 just really restricted and tied down, and it's having a hard time finding a role. So now f6. Playing f6 in this kind of position is always risky as black because you're opening up that 7th rank. But Alekhine, did pretty much correctly to figure out that allowing the white knight to come in on e5 eventually wasn't going to be tolerable. So Botvinnik moves his king closer to the center. And of course, white's not going to trade rooks. And now g5. What Alekhine was trying to stop was white's knight from coming into f5, so taking over the h4 square. Now, by the way, again, knight d7 doesn't help black at all. White would just play rook c7 and continue to tie black's pieces down. He didn't play knight d7. That's my fault. Now knight e1. So the knight's going to either d3 and b4 or c2 and e3, right, to put pressure on that d5 pawn. Now h5. He's trying to create some counterplay, and now Botvinnik played a really great move. So think like Botvinnik. How do you think he played here? By the way, I already told you about one possible. Knight c2 would be perfectly okay, but his move, I think, is even better. He didn't play rook c7. As Alekhine defended earlier, he would play rook f7.
Right.
And that rook wouldn't be able to stay there.
I was thinking rook e3, but then you just do king to f7.
You're thinking what?
Rook e3, but then you can just follow king f7.
Well, if rook e3, I think black would play knight c6. you'd let that knight out. It's very instructive too. King e2 would also probably be fine. So I mean, generally speaking, when you're in an endgame, if your opponent just has one weakness, usually they can defend that okay. In this case, the pawn on d5 is the problem for black, because like I've been saying, you can target it very easily with knight c2, e3. But just one weakness isn't always enough, so you have to have more than one target. I'm sure that principle has been, paraphrased other places. I've heard people even call it the principle of two weaknesses. I'm not sure where it comes from. But in this case, Alekhine's ambition has caused him a problem. By the way, he played h5 not to attack on the king side or anything like that, but to remove his pawns from the 7th rank, so that when the white rook arrives there, it'll have no targets. So it's logical in that sense. So the problem with playing h5 is that the pawn is really far from your king, and so it's hard to defend. So Botvinnik played h4, exactly. So this is a really nice move, because if black advances, say g4, then the knight would come to d3, and there would be two separate targets, right? h5 and d5, and that's not defensible for black. And if black were to take on h4, then knight f3, followed by taking the pawn and coming to f5, would also be a very bad situation for black. So he played knight d7, but now rook c7 and knight f3. So black's forced to make an unpleasant decision here. He has to push on g4. Again, taking on h4, knight takes, would give white too much activity. But the problem with pushing is that now when the knight comes to e1, that f4 square is going to look awfully juicy. But Alekhine does solve this problem by occupying it. But this isn't perfect either.
Now you can do knight b4 and target those two different pawns.
So knight b4 would definitely be okay, but it was not his choice. One problem with knight b4 is that black can then play f3 and get some activity of his own. White's certainly not losing and still winning there, but black probably has a little more counterplay there than what Botvinnik's choice allowed. However, the theme of this game is restriction. You don't want to let black get activity. Well, black's knight has been the problem this whole game. By taking an f4 and letting black exchange it off, you're kind of helping him solve problems. And besides, tactically, I don't think it works out well either after maybe g3, and then a rook d4, followed by taking that one. So if you notice something about f4 is that black moved it to a square that white's knight attacks. So remember, the point of h4 earlier was to fix the weakness on h5. So if we play along the same logic, how can we keep that up? Exactly, f3. Fixing the weakness on f4. So at this point, black's advanced pawns just give him too many weaknesses. So knight b4 was okay, but f3 is far simpler. It doesn't give black any counterplay now. So he captured and played a5, but it doesn't matter. White can sit. Problem for black is it's so hard to make any progress untying your pieces here.
And black didn't have any counterattacks in the g file?
Well, you can't penetrate on the g file because the knight hangs, and you can't move your knight and exchange rooks because f4 would fall. So black's tied up in knots.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So that's why he moved the king over so that he can free up his rook, but it's too slow. So now white moves the rook over to the king side. And at this point, apparently, Alekhine said he would have just resigned after rook g5, because black can't exchange because that gives white the passed g pawn, and if he doesn't, he'll just win h5. But Botvinnik's choice is simple enough too, and he also wins a pawn this way. And now it's just a trivial rook and pawn endgame win for white. And Alekhine now just resigned. He's going to lose the f4 pawn as well, so that gives white 3 extra pawns, which is too much. So I really like this game just because of the logic and consistency of Botvinnik, and that's kind of reflected from his personality too. Once he had an idea, he just kept following through with it. In this case, it was restricting Black's Queen's Knight and also creating and fixing weaknesses that Black had. Black played h5, created a weakness, so Botvinnik fixed it with h4, and then Alekhine created another weakness with f4, and he fixed it with f3. So these are really good principles to keep in mind. And also, I talked about earlier about just having one weakness. It's really easy to just hone in on that one weakness when you see it, but it's usually not enough to win. Right? So any questions or comments in this game? All right. Now we're looking at another game, and the significance of this game is his contribution to opening theory. So I'm sure many of you, if you ever played e4 before, are familiar with the g4 pawn thrust to attack Black on the king side. It's really common in, say, the Knight Orf Sicilian, White will play g4, or in a Dragon, White will play g4 to dislodge that knight from the king side. It's really common in all kinds of king pawn openings. But in d4, at least previous to Botvinnik, it wasn't really such a common idea to play g4 and attack on the king side that way. If you look at, the games of Alekhine or Capablanca as White with d4, you're not going to see them playing g4 very often. It wasn't really considered a thing. Their thing was more about centralization, piece activity. So Botvinnik introduced some really cool idea. And it wasn't just in one opening either. So in this case, it was an Imzo-Indian. So just a brief aside, in this opening, by playing knight e2, although White's knights are awkward, White does force Black to either trade the bishop without damaging the pawn structure, or else move it back and kind of waste some time. So at the time, theory said that Black was okay here because even though Black's pawn on d5 was a bit awkward and he was a little bit underdeveloped, White's king on f1 made people think that White wasn't going to have anything. But here Botvinnik unleashed g4. And this all of a sudden gives Black some serious problems because Black has no time to castle now because of g5, and then the d5 pawn would fall. And White also has this nasty possible kingside attack. In the game, Smyslov chose c6. Although it turns out the correct move is more radical. The right move here for Black is actually g5. If you know anything about Smyslov, he was also a very classical player. So, if Botvinnik knew that this was the right move, he probably guessed that he wouldn't even find it. Of course, the logic here is that it's just logical, right? White's threatening to play g5, so you play it yourself with gain of time. And it turns out that gain of time is just enough to give Black perfectly reasonable position. But Smyslov didn't find this, so c6, which seems logical, but unfortunately it gives White a nice initiative on the king side. Now, just by the way, h6 isn't a good idea because it's going to make castling more dangerous always. So, for example, queen f3, c6, and now White could just play like h4. And now castling would be suicidal because after g5, White's going to open the g or the h file, and your king is going to be way too loose, right? For example, takes, just queen h5, and Black's toast. But now g5 and h4. And at this point, Black's not lost, but the correct move is the castle. It may look like you're castling into it, but your king is going to be safer on the king side than the center, as it turns out, because White is going to have this e4 break. And Smyslov definitely underestimated this. He played bishop d6, trying to avoid committing his king, but it didn't work out well because now e4, and suddenly this e file is now open. And now with the threat of knight d6, Black has no choice but to castle. But White is just getting far too much activity here. And now black has a problem because taking on d5, again, it's almost just suicidal because queen takes, hitting the rook. And if you play knight a6, then g6 is just devastating. You can't play h takes, queen f7 would be mate. So black would be in some serious trouble. So he gave up the exchange in the hopes that after getting this pawn on g5 that he has some compensation. But now Botvinnik found a nice way to convert. By the way, I'll tell you ahead of time that the most natural looking move, just taking on c6, getting rid of the pawn that's under attack, isn't a good idea because black can play knight takes and he has some semblance of compensation, right? Your king on f1 is kind of awkward and suddenly black is developed. So try to keep black's activity in check here. What's that?
Queen to e2.
Queen e2. So you're threatening queen e8 checkmate, right? Let's see. Well, I certainly don't see a problem right now. Let's see. So I think against that, black would probably play knight f6. That's probably reasonable, but here I don't see a way to avoid taking on c6 now. And taking on b8 doesn't look that great either, because black always has this, and then you can take. Any suggestions? So the problem with rook g1 is that black would play queen takes d5, and white's essentially either forced to trade queens, or if white doesn't trade queens, say you play like bishop f4 or something, then black could play knight a6. And black would then have a couple pawns for the exchange.
And if you did trade queens, then black would have an isolated queen pawn.
Oh yeah, I mean, rook g1 is probably fine. But Botvinnik's move is much simpler. Against rook g1, what would black do? I'm thinking the issue might be queen f5, queen f6. Okay, well, I'll have to give you full credit actually, because I think rook g1 looks fine too.
What do you think of queen f3?
Yeah, so in the game he played queen f3, and the point is that white threatens d takes c6, and he played queen takes d5. Now c takes d5 wouldn't work out because now rook g1 is pretty devastating, because when you take on d5, black has no way to keep it defended, and that rook on a8 is also trapped. But after queen takes d5, white has a very nice move here.
Rook d1?
No, rook d1, black would play knight c6, maybe knight f6, and be happy. I think knight f6.
And if he was to release bishop to e5 to attack the knight?
Okay, so for example, rook d1, knight f6, bishop e5, knight d7.
Oh, yeah.
Rook c1.
Mm-hmm. Shades of his game with Alekhine, right? Again, restriction. Just denying that knight access to the c6 square. And he tried knight a6, hoping to be able to play knight a c5. And so...
b4.
Exactly. So that knight just remains exiled on a6, and its future is pretty dim. And I don't think Smyslov lasted much longer here. So Botvinnik eventually just pushed and won a pawn for it. And yeah, I think he just gave up the ghost here. Yeah. Of course, knight e4 doesn't work because of rook c7. So yeah, this was a really nice example of he just threw people off with his g4 advance, but it's really pretty logical. Knight at f6 was important to defend the king side and the d5 square. Kind of similar to how it is in the king pawn openings a lot. In the dragon, black needs to defend the d5 square and h7. In the knight orf, black needs to defend the king and also the d5 square. And so here, pretty similar idea. Any questions or comments here? All right.
I mentioned that Mikhail Botvinnik had some strings pulled to get him to be able to participate in some tournaments in the 1920s. Those strings were pulled by Nikolai Krylenko. Now, I've talked about Nikolai Krylenko in the Soviet School of Chess lecture, but I need to talk about him again because he was the architect of the Soviet chess program from the Bolshevik Revolution until the late 1930s, when he himself was executed as an enemy of the state on trumped-up charges, along with bunches and bunches of other people. So during the Civil War, Krylenko was appointed Supreme Commander of the Army. Toward the end of the war, World War I, he was the Supreme Commander, so highest post, obviously. Afterward, he became a prosecutor. His specialty was taking people that had been accused of being enemies of the state, putting them through show trials, basically 20-minute long trials in which the charges were trumped up. The arrested were tortured for days on end to get them to confess. They confessed in court, and then they were summarily executed right after the trial. They were just taken outside and shot. This guy was not a nice guy. In fact, when he took over as Supreme Commander of the Army, he actually had his predecessor taken out and bayoneted, stabbed with little bayonets at the end of the rifles, and then trampled to death by horses. Not the most pleasant of people. And that inspired some fear. Obviously, executing the innocent will impress the masses even more. The purges under Stalin were witch hunts, pure and simple. Those witch hunts took the form of putting people through show trials and executing them. It also took the form of sending people to the Gulag, the prison labor camps, typically in Siberia, where their chances of survival were pretty slim. And this happened on a massive scale in the Soviet Union from the mid to late 1920s through the beginning of World War II. It's one of the reasons the Soviet Union suffered so much in World War II, because they had purged so many military commanders. But I get ahead of myself. Krylenko was an architect of the Soviet chess program. He had played chess with Lenin himself on many occasions, and Krylenko supposedly was a pretty strong player. If he were playing today, he'd be about master strength. And if you want to know more about Krylenko and his atrocities, there's a chess writer named Kevin Spraggett, who has a really nice page on the internet about Krylenko, so I would suggest that. So Krylenko was Botvinnik's supporter and patron for a long while. Now, Botvinnik was not his first choice because he was Jewish and his parents were from the bourgeoisie, but he was good at chess, so you needed to have a Soviet competitor for the World Championship. So Botvinnik, after he proved his worth, was directed toward that. So Botvinnik graduated high school at the age of 16. He couldn't go to the local university until he was 17. He wanted to enter a program in engineering, electrical engineering to be specific, but he couldn't do that, so he had to take a year off. And while he did that, he played chess. What a shame, right? And this is reminiscent of Paul Morphy, who graduated early because he was brilliant and wanted to go to law school, but he was too young, so he had to take a year off, and he spent it touring Europe and playing chess. Well, so this is what Botvinnik did, but the idea of going to a university was super important for a couple of reasons. Understand that there are no real professional chess players at this time. The first person to be, and there is some disagreement on this point because people say, well, what did other chess players do? And I'll say, oh, well, Smyslov was a baritone singer, actually quite good. Taimanov was a concert pianist, and Karpov was an economist, on and on. But to be honest, they spent most of their time playing chess. And Botvinnik, while he was an electrical engineer, and during the war, World War II, he actually worked at it quite hard, he got special privileges from the government. So when other people had to work 5 or 6 days a week, he might have to work 3. And the rest of the time he could focus on chess. So he did prioritize getting a university education, not only because it was expected, but also because of his political beliefs. Botvinnik was a communist through and through. He really believed in it. And he thought that one of the ways to achieve communism was through the advancement of technology. For example, electrification, this idea of installing electrical grids in parts of the country that had never seen artificial light or that could never use electric motors, so for factories and for citizens. And he was a big believer that this sort of progress would benefit society and benefit the worker. And so he actually devoted his life, his professional life, to electrical grids. So he was a believer in communism through technocratic means, if you will. as opposed to perhaps ideological means. I said that Botvinnik was not the first choice. Krylenko's first choice was Nikolai Ryumin. His parents were workers, factory workers. He was not Jewish, he was Russian, ethnically Russian. Remember, Jewish does not necessarily mean the religion. Botvinnik was atheist by all accounts, but ethnically both of his parents were Jewish, and therefore he was considered Jewish. Ryumin had all the credentials, and he was from Moscow. Now, I mentioned in the Soviet School of Chess lecture that there was a rivalry between Moscow and St. Petersburg, or Leningrad. They had competitions against each other where they'd send their best players, almost like college football rivalries or something to that level. Now, that rivalry ended when the siege of Leningrad occurred and so many great chess players died or had to leave St. Petersburg to survive. But at the time, Ryumin had the backers of Moscow. Botvinnik had the backers, kind of, in Leningrad. Remember, some of the older generation hated his guts. But Krylenko originally wanted Ryumin to be their candidate for the World Chess Championship, but on many, many occasions, Botvinnik beat him. In the 1931 Soviet Championship, Botvinnik wins. He's 20 years old. He's the champion. And he beats Ryumin by 2 full points. That's pretty significant. It's not like he just barely edged out a win, right? Well, could he repeat that? Yes, he could. In 1933, the 8th Soviet Championship, Botvinnik wins again. And you see Ryumin is down in a paltry 10th place, not even close. And I found this quote in the book. To celebrate, Botvinnik got drunk, apparently for the first and only time in his life, which is pretty uncommon in Russia. Remember, Botvinnik doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. This is quite uncommon at the time, right? But he wins again in 1933. So you have world championship matches occurring outside of the Soviet Union. You have Alekhine, who played Bogolyubov a couple of times in the late 1920s, and after he took the title from Capablanca, never gave Capablanca a chance to rematch. And then you had Alekhine, who lost his title to Max Owa, and then regained it later on. I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. And by the way, for the people who like to question this online, that pronunciation is actually correct. People say Erver. No, it's not. It's Owa. Sorry. What else is Botvinnik doing? Well, he's still going to school. He is working on his master's degree by this point, and he falls in love. He falls in love with a woman named, that he calls Ganoshka, Gayan Ananova, and she's a ballet dancer in Leningrad. And they fall in love, they get married, and they had one daughter, Olga, who I've already mentioned. Olga says that, the parents were very, very different. How so? Well, she was religious, he wasn't. He was political, she wasn't. So he was atheist, she was apolitical. He was hard and firm, and she was gentle. But in many ways, she was, and I talked about this a bit with Petrosian's wife, who was quite a supporting character in his success. Anushka was that same way with Botvinnik. She really protected him, going so far as to sit outside of his hotel room while he was sleeping to prevent him from being interrupted. But she kept up her career in the ballet, by the way, for many, many years afterward. You know that by this time, organizers in the Soviet Union feel that their chess players are progressing to the point where they can start hosting international tournaments. And I have to explain this. The Soviet Union was not fighting a war with the West at this point, militarily, but they were ideologically. They wanted to show that communism was the superior form of government, and that it led to the superior society, and that the Soviet Union was superior in every way that mattered, and one of those ways was chess. So they had high hopes that a Russian would win the World Chess Championship, and that Russians would win prestigious international tournaments. But they didn't host any of those tournaments, and they didn't send very many players to those tournaments until they felt like they had the level to do so. And the first time that happened was in Moscow, 1935, when they invited a bunch of people to come play, including Capablanca. You'll notice one big name that's not there is Alekhine. Why? Because Alekhine had defected in the about 15 years previously, and he was persona non grata on Russian soil. Another name you will not see there is Bogolyubov, who had defected around 1926, I believe, and he wasn't allowed to come back either. So these are two of the top 5 players, certainly in the world, who were not invited. Otherwise, a very strong grouping. And you'll see that there are a lot of Soviet players there, and there's only one of them who finished in the top 5, and that was Botvinnik. So they at least have one person, Botvinnik, who ties for first, that shows that they can compete with anybody in the world. And this was okay with them, by the way. They didn't care about the Olympiads. They didn't even send teams to most of the Olympiads. The Americans won the chess Olympiads throughout the 30s, and the Russians didn't blink an eye. They didn't care about that. They were looking at individual stuff. And this is important to understand, because you may think, well, why can't they send Ryumin and Botvinnik? Just like the Americans sent Reshevsky and Rubin Fine. Well, they can't. They send one person. He is the embodiment of their whole system. And that also made it really high stakes. In the U.S., Reshevsky, Rubin Fine, they competed, and 1 year one was national champion, the other was another, and it was hard to say at a certain point who was better until Rubin Fine focused more on his professional psychological practice, and Reshevsky emerged as a stronger player. The Russians didn't necessarily have that. They wanted to send their best representative, and they had to figure out who that was. So on the one hand, that meant that Botvinnik got a lot of favors because he was that guy. He got a good monthly stipend. He got a lot of benefits. When other Russians couldn't get their hands on things, he could. He could get furniture imported. He could get caviar. He could call in favors to get tournament invites. And others struggled to do that same thing. But it also meant he had a lot of pressure. The regime wanted him to guarantee that he was going to win a tournament if they were going to send him. Even in writing, they wanted him to sign a declaration that he was going to win a match or a tournament before they'd even agree to send him, and that put Botvinnik in a precarious position. He would say, well, what if I blunder a night? And he says, well, you're Russian, you can't blunder a night. High stakes, right? But also high rewards. After he wins this tournament, his stipend is raised from 300 rubles a month to 500 rubles a month. Even if we don't have a good way of converting rubles to current dollars, we can all agree that that's a substantial raise. And he got a car. 1935 is pretty rare. He gets a car. So big status symbols for his tournament results here. Well, it follows this up with a trip to Nottingham in England. They're now going to send players abroad. Incidentally, Botvinnik was allowed to bring his wife on this trip. They went shopping. And if you remember my lecture on Mikhail Tal, I told you that this is really rare. Why? Because the risk of defection was so high. If you didn't have any collateral back at home, if you didn't have any leverage back at home to get them to come back, make them choose between abandoning their family and defecting. But they trusted Botvinnik enough to allow him to travel with his wife, and at certain occasions in the future with his daughter as well. Took the whole family. Took a large amount of cash with him. And incidentally, it's kind of a funny story. What they did, and this is all the Soviet masters at the time, they were allowed to keep 1/2 of their winnings abroad. So what was expected is when they were processed by customs that they surrender 1/2 of their winnings back to the government, and then they keep 1/2. Well, the loophole is if you spent it, you didn't have to give any of it back. So they'd take their prize winnings and they'd spend it. And apparently there's a story with, I think it was Salo Flor who said this. They said the ambassador asked him, well, where's your prize winnings? You have to give us 1/2. And he said, well, I spent it on shoes. Do you want the left one or the right one? And after that, they kind of took a hands-off approach and let the players keep their winnings, provided they at least spent it, claimed they spent it or whatever. So those tournaments and those prize monies were important sources of revenue for them. But anyway, he goes there and he plays in a tournament, and he does not do well. He ties with Capablanca for the lead, which is a fine result, actually. particularly because at this tournament you have Bogolyubov, you have Alekhine, you have the strongest players in the world. You'll look at that list and you'll see that there is Capablanca, Uwa, Botvinnik, Alekhine, all current or future world champions. You see a lot of challengers there. Bogolyubov was a challenger. There were attempts to have matches with Reshevsky or even with Salo Flores as challengers, but those didn't quite happen. The only person missing from the top 10 that I can find is Lilienthal, who is a Soviet player. I'm not entirely sure why he wasn't there. Also, true story, the terror is going on in the Soviet Union while this is occurring. People are being purged. And the day that Botvinnik played Vidmar, that day there was one of those puppet trials with 14 very high-ranking Soviet officials who were put on trial and then shot immediately after while they're in there playing chess in Nottingham, which is an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, you're playing chess for prize money to represent the Soviet Union. On the other hand, people you know are dying. It's a weird feeling. It'd be hard to juggle that. Well, in 1935, Krylenko organizes the tournament in Moscow. They invite a bunch of people. Botvinnik didn't really like that system. He said, we should invite fewer people and do it like a double round robin. And that was more expensive because the tournament would last longer, so you have to put people up in hotels for longer. But basically, Stalin gave Krylenko carte blanche and said, yeah, do it. So they did, and they invited some people you might recognize, like Emanuel Lasker is there. You have Botvinnik over there. You have, everybody, you have Lilienthal who attended this, Flor, Capablanca, Ragozin, who is a strong ally and friend of Botvinnik. Levinfish is there. Ilya Khan, we know from the Khan Sicilian. And Nikolai Ryumin is also there. So you have some really strong players. They play a double round robin. And how did that turn out? Well, Capablanca actually won. And he didn't have to win. In fact, Botvinnik could have tied, but before the last round, he was approached for let's say, some arranged results, and he refused, and then he ended up drawing instead of winning, and Botvinnik, or Capablanca, won instead of drawing, and that pushed Capablanca over the top, so it kind of backfired against him. But anyway, Botvinnik didn't win, but he did okay. Capablanca edged him out, but you know how the Soviet press spun this? Well, Capablanca's old. His days are numbered. And sadly, it's actually true. He had a stroke a couple years later and didn't really play chess after that. But they painted it as, well, yeah, okay, Capablanca won, but Botvinnik's young. Anyway. Incidentally, Botvinnik didn't do very much in 1937. He claimed he was working on his master's thesis. I don't know, for those of you who've done that, it's one thing to claim it, it's another thing to actually do it. But anyway, he did get a master's degree, so at least there's that. But he did not play very much in 1937. While that's happening, well, you have the terror and more purges in full swing. The first guy, I'm not going to try to butcher his name. It's a Georgian name, and it's pretty tough. He was the guy who awarded Botvinnik the car in 1935. The official report is that he committed suicide, or that he died of a heart attack. However, the unofficial hypothesis is that he committed suicide or that he was forced to commit suicide by the secret police. So that's the guy that gave Botvinnik his car, dead. The middle guy was the guy who awarded Botvinnik his badge of honor. He committed suicide before he could get arrested and purged, dead. Third guy was the Secretary General of Komsomol, and Botvinnik was a member. It's like the all-youth Union of Lenin or something. It's a political organization tied to the communist regime, and he was the head of that. Botvinnik certainly knew him very well. He was murdered. He was shot. In addition, there were a lot of chess players that were purged, and some of them are not very well known to history, and I couldn't find pictures of them, but one was named, I'm going to anglicize it, Peter Smyslov, who was tried in secret in April of 1937, and after a 20-minute trial, he was shot. Incidentally, he died having a career 2 wins, 0 losses record against Botvinnik. dead. And one of the things that he was actually accused of his anti-communist activity, was participating in foreign tournaments. Some people get to get away with it, other people couldn't. There was a guy named Sergei Kamener. He was a childhood friend of Botvinnik. They'd known each other in their school days. He knew his day was coming. He went up to Botvinnik and he said, here's all my research. I know they're going to destroy it. I know my days are numbered. Here, you take it. And Botvinnik took his little secret file and kept it and didn't tell the authorities, didn't surrender to the authorities. And actually, if he had been caught with it, it could have been a bad thing for him. And he didn't reveal it until many, many years later. But his childhood friend was executed in September of 1938. It's a very volatile time in the Soviet Union, and Botvinnik is navigating it quite smoothly. There are a couple of hiccups here and there, which we'll get to. But for the most part, he is doing just fine. He's part of the elite, getting lots of privileges. He is not living in the same kind of housing conditions as the masses. You know, he has a 2-room apartment, not a communal apartment. And he's able to use his winnings to buy things abroad, like heaters and an ironing board. It's a big deal. He ironed his own clothes. It was a very tough time in the Soviet Union, and it's going to be followed by an even tougher time, which we'll get to after we look at a few more games.
So the next game with Petrosian we're going to look at is the continuation of his, contribution to this move G4 in Queen's Pawn opening theory. All right, so let's get started. So we have this slightly unusual variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. Now, the point of Bishop E7 is to not give White that kind of ideal attacking setup in the Carlsbad pawn structure. So, Knight F6, by the way, is perfectly acceptable, but it gives White the additional option of playing this line. Where White will develop the knight to E2 instead of F3. By allowing White to develop the bishop on G5 early on, White can play E3 and then commit the knight to E2 instead of F3. And the point of this is that White will aim to play F3 and potentially E4 and get a really large pawn center that way. Now Black's not just lost, he has counterplay there too, but Petrosian preferred to not allow this more dynamic possibility. So that's why he chose this slightly offbeat variation with Bishop E7. Now, at the time, it was considered that, although it looked a bit odd, there wasn't really a disadvantage of playing it, although Botvinnik came up with a nice innovation to show that there is a downside. So this is a big point for Black. Now, if Black can put that bishop on F5, White won't get this potentially dangerous or annoying battery that White has with Bishop D3 and Queen C2. And generally speaking, the light squared bishop for Black in this opening is one of the more annoying pieces to activate. So by playing Bishop F5 early, it looks pretty good. But as you can guess from my discussion of his opening contribution, he played this G4 move. So in this case, it's not to dislodge the knight from F6, but instead to try to dominate the B1 H7 diagonal so that he can develop his bishop more actively than Black's. Now the first point is that Bishop G6 would be ideal, but unfortunately it would allow White to gain more space with more time by simply playing H4. And Black will be forced to waste more time with a move like H6 or H5 in order to avoid losing the bishop. And by the way, taking the pawn at H4 would be very risky because of Queen B3. It turns out that Black's queen side is very loose. After B6, White has a couple good choices already. White can play Queen A4, threatening to take on B8 and C6. And it's rather awkward threat to meet. Although the computer also likes simply takes and then knight takes D5. Rather sharp option. It's very interesting. The point being that if Black takes, after Queen takes, the rook is smothered, can't move. And of course, if you don't take it, then knight C7 is going to win that rook there. So taking h4, by the way, would just be not a good idea. So, kind of seeing this, Petrosian dropped it back to e6. So now it can't be harassed with more space and you get a time by move like h4. And now Botvinnik kind of calms down and plays h3. So now that he's driven the bishop off of that diagonal that he wants, h3 shores up that king side. Now we come to d3. And now king f1 is a nice circumspect move. Now this is better than castling, and it's kind of a point worth remembering. Why do you think he didn't castle instead?
So we can push the h pawn.
Yeah, the point is that white's king side is more loose. The rook on h1 does not defend pawn h3. So after g5, black could play knight h7. And it's not really that great of a position for white. H4 isn't desirable because this bishop could come to a nice spot on g4. So white doesn't want to let that happen. And so king f1 is an important detail there. Now castle, king g2. And Petrosian's managed to trade some pieces, but again, we're left with this situation where that bishop on e6 is just so passive. And it turns out to be difficult to find an active role for that bishop and ends up spelling long-term difficulties. Now Petrosian's last couple moves may look goofy, but he's trying to avoid moving any pawn on the king side. He didn't like to create weaknesses and give possibility for attack, so that's why he's playing in this manner. So a move like g6 may look nice, but after rook e1, suddenly white has, not right now, but we'll have attacking ideas. Bishop takes g6, rook takes e6, even f3 and h4 later too. So whenever you move a pawn on the king side, it's a commitment. So he's trying to avoid that. You may wonder why knight f6 even works, because it looks like g5 wins a pawn. But the point is white's position is a little bit loose for that. After knight h5, bishop h7, and king h8, white has both the pawn on g5 and the bishop on f4 hanging, so he's not going to be able to keep the material. So he shored up his position with f3. And again, from the previous two games we looked at, Botvinnik really liked to restrict his opponent's activity. In this case, f3 not only protects g4, but means that knight e4 is never going to be a possibility for black either. Now, of course, Botvinnik's not tempted by a move like bishop f6 because the dark squares are just too weak, right? For example, if you take and then take h7, you have d4 hanging, and also black's intending queen f4, so it's not necessary to give yourself complications like that. Also, queen h4 is probably even more lethal, right? If you play like rook d1, queen h4, threatening the bishop, and queen g3, bad news, right? So rook e1. So again, it may seem like black's doing fine. The bishop on e6 blocks the rooks from operating on the e-file, and he doesn't really have that many weaknesses, just the one on d5. But the problem is that white has a superior minor piece, and this turns out to be enough. Petrosian is trying to play like Botvinnik too by, b6 is an important move to keep the knight out, but the knight has greener pastures too, via the e5 square. And f6 trying to keep it out of there too, and so h4 is logical, so you can play g5 and then get the square anyway. So now we're in an endgame where it's actually pretty hopeless for black due to that light squared bishop's lack of targets. And that knight has great squares on e5 or f4 or potentially c5 as we'll see later. And now the king enters the fray. A lot of times you'll hear about endgames, the bishop will be better when you have pawns on both sides of the board, But in this case, the problem is that one of white's pawns is on d4, so it can't be targeted, and white's king is also just so much more active that it doesn't even matter. And white's king is just too far advanced, protecting the queening square for the pawn. So black is in serious trouble here. And Petrosian resigned because d7, and black can't check on the c file because of rook c7. So white's going to win that black rook. So yeah, really nice game, and you'll even see this g4 idea employed at the highest levels today. You see Wesley So, Nakamura, Carlsen, they've all played this idea as white. And just one more comment too about g4. He hasn't just influenced even these two openings. There have been other people who came up with opening innovations that are inspired by Botvinnik. So let me just bring up an analysis board. So if you came here for, I gave a lecture on the Slav defense. I briefly covered the Shirov variation against the Moran, and that line features the g4 idea too. So in this anti-Moran line with queen c2, g4, the Shirov variation, was a very important invention by him. And also the Makaganov variation of the King's Indian defense, very popular with American GM Conrad Holt. That features white playing for the g4 idea, and that's in this King's Indian line. Where white plays h3 and aims to play g4 later here. And the idea here is not only to discourage black from playing f5, but in some cases kick the knight from f6 and attack on the king side. So g4 pops up a lot in queen pawn openings, and we owe a lot of that to Botvinnik and his success in employing that as white. And it's even been featured in Imzo Indian too. I didn't get the game, but Irina Krush had a nice game where she played g4 in the Nimzo Indian too. So Botvinnik inspired a new generation of chess players to play this move with d4 too. So now let's look at his game with Portisch. Now this is a different example of his chess. Now Botvinnik used to think that tactics were his weakness in chess. He would always criticize himself after a game for missing this or that, but it turns out he was actually no klutz when it came to tactics. So let's look at one of his games where he just crushes his opponent. So it's an English opening, so it turns into like a reverse dragon. So it's unusually for Botvinnik. It's somewhat messy, complicated game with white. And already Portisch kind of makes an opening mistake here. Instead of a5, it's better to just castle. And if white plays b4, maybe play a5 later, try to soften up the white queen side. Because the problem with playing a5 is that although you restrict white from playing b4, you weaken that b6 square. And that means you have to move that knight and lose some time. And now black has a problem because if you just let that knight sit there, white will take it, say take on b6, queen a4, queen b5, and that pawn's going to be annoying to defend. So black traded. Black could have also played knight d5, by the way, but after bishop c5, white's happy here too. So now white has a pretty healthy dragon position. Generally speaking, white's very happy to trade a pair of knights in this opening because white has a little bit less space. Now white piles rooks on the c file, so now black can't move that knight. And now he makes pretty much the decisive error here. Knight b8 was far too passive. E4 was relatively better, but still not perfect because white could just take and play queen b5, and white still has some nasty pressure here. So yeah, knight b8 turns out to be a very bad idea, but he thought it was tactically justified. because after rook takes c7, he thought that bishop c6 would force white to give up the exchange. But it does not work out. So white to play, see if you can find what Botvinnik did here. So you have the right idea, but yeah, I think the problem with rook takes f7 immediately is that black can play bishop takes f3 and get rid of one attacker. So rook takes c6 first. Yeah, and now he played b takes c6, knight takes c6 would be a similar thing, and now rook f7. Yeah, and the difference here is that if we take the rook, and by the way, he didn't take the rook because now king f7, knight g5 is pretty much decisive, right? King g8, queen c4 with a typical smothered mate. And if king g6, we can play queen e4, and black's also dead, right? King f6, queen f3. So the rook is definitely immune. So h6. So now we're threatening to take the rook because g5 square is covered. So rook b7, queen c8. And now white to play again. See if you can find how Botvinnik finished up here. Yep. Turns out white doesn't even need the rook. The light squares in black's position are just far too weak. After queen takes, knight g6.
Bishop e4.
Mm-hmm. So what's the threat behind bishop b4?
Discovery.
Well, white has many different discoveries. And white is down a rook in an exchange, so unless you deliver checkmate,
Oh, I see it.
yeah, knight e7 and queen g8.
Yeah.
And turns out that's pretty hard to defend against. Black can defend the g8 square, but doesn't mean it saves him. Has to play g6. Why not king h8?
Oh, knight to f7 check.
Yeah, knight f7, and then knight d6, and the queen falls. So g6, but now bishop takes, and then how do you finish it off?
Bishop takes h6.
Mm-hmm. And I believe he just resigned here, yeah. Now black is seriously just toast. If you take the bishop, queen h4, and queen h7, and lights out. King f6, knight g4. Yeah, king e6, bishop f5, king d5. See, is there a mate here?
How about e4 check?
Yeah, I don't think there's quite a mate, but
That's a free queen.
yeah, you can just take on b7.
Oh yeah.
Or, even here, queen b7 is probably even more devastating. Attacking both rooks. But anyway, after bishop h6, he just resigned. So yeah, even though Botvinnik mostly with white played solid simple position, solid simple chess, it didn't mean that he, if his opponents violated the principles of chess like knight b8, that he couldn't just win and crush his opponents. So any questions here? All right.
So after the Moscow tournament in 1936 and the fact that Botvinnik didn't really play in 1937 because of his master's thesis, the next big event was the Avro tournament of 1938. Now, the Avro tournament was designed to be a way to determine who was going to challenge Alekhine for the championship. Because it was presumed that Alekhine was going to finish in the top two and that the other person would be the challenger. That's not quite what happened. Instead, you had Keres and Fine who tied for first, and you had Botvinnik in third, and Capablanca and Alekhine and even Owa, they're down below that. They're not in the top two. So you look at it and you go, well, we have the current champion and the previous challenger and the challenger before that, but who are we going to have to challenge Alekhine. And there was talk of it being Rubin Fine. There was talk of it being Smyslov. There's talk of it being Botvinnik, but we'll get to that. I have a position up here on the board because this was a game that was played in this tournament. It was Botvinnik with the white pieces against Capablanca. And in this position, Botvinnik made what many consider to be one of the best moves ever. You can see what Kasparov thought about it, obviously. And hopefully you've been taking some time to consider it while I've been rambling. But I'll give you a little bit longer to consider, and we'll see. You may know it because it's in a lot of books, but we'll see if you can find it. Any thoughts?
Bishop A3.
Now, did you know this move or did you see this move?
I knew it.
You knew it. But remember earlier when I told you, you had that tactic with using your bishop for attraction. I said, remember that? It's going to come up again. Well, here it is. Yeah, bishop A3 was the move that Botvinnik played, which is devastating. Queen takes bishop, but then you have to know the follow-up move. What's the follow-up move that white has in mind after queen takes A3? I know you know it. See if someone else sees it. So we have bishop H3, queen takes A3, and then, so the follow-up?
Knight H5.
Knight H5 with check is the bolt here, the bolt from the blue. So G takes H5, then we follow with Queen G5 check, King F8, Queen takes F6 check, King G8, E7. This passed pawn is now unstoppable. And what black does here is checks the white king a bunch of times, and then when Capablanca runs out of checks, he resigns. So bishop A3, knight H5 are the winning moves, essentially. So this was and people don't give Botvinnik enough credit for his tactical prowess. They say, Botvinnik was he prepared the openings like no other, and he was brilliant at chess psychology, and he was a strong in-game player, and all those things are true, but he was also a very good combinative player, to use the old term. We would say a tactician now. Despite that, he did not win. Also, piece of trivia here, you may know that Botvinnik designed a computer program. What'd you call it? Anybody know the name of it? He called it Pioneer. And Botvinnik wanted a Pioneer to think like a human, not use brute force like Stockfish and other modern engines these days, but to think like a human, more like Google's program called AlphaGo, which was just used recently to beat one of the strongest Go players in the world decisively in a match. But Botvinnik wanted his program to think like a brilliant human, and when he put this position in, he was very disappointed that the computer wanted him to play knight f5 with check and completely missed the bishop a3 idea. So he had to tweak his algorithm until it could find bishop a3. Darn it. Incidentally, there's been some analysis recently, and h4 also wins in this position. And you look that up if you want some analysis there. But one thing that's really interesting about this tournament is, and not a lot of people know this, and in fact the chess players of the era didn't even know it, after the tournament was over, Botvinnik arranged a meeting with Alekhine to open discussions, negotiations about a world championship match. They came to a gentleman's agreement on the terms that Botvinnik would need to find the funding, needed to come up with $10,000. That was the requirement. For Capablanca, incidentally, Capablanca had to come up with $10,000 in gold, which was actually more closer to $18,000 in cash. Capablanca didn't have the same terms as everybody else. But if Botvinnik could raise $10,000, then they would arrange a match, even a match in the Soviet Union, and that Alekhine would be invited back and allowed back on Soviet soil, despite his defection. It had been enough years, I suppose, and maybe the Soviet officials were so hungry for a chess champion, or at least a shot at a chess championship, that they would accept that. Unknown to Botvinnik is that Alekhine had parallel negotiations with other players at the same time, including Paul Keres. Anyway. Also at this time, Botvinnik starts teaching. In 1940, they convert a former palace of Tsar Alexander III in St. Petersburg. They convert it into a pioneer school. And you know this from my lecture on Peter Svidler, Meet the Candidate Peter Svidler, and Boris Spassky, a lot of famous chess players learned there. Botvinnik taught there starting in 1940. He taught every Sunday until the Nazis invaded a little over a year later. And he taught actually in the former study of Tsar Alexander III. He was converted into a chess classroom. So obviously that tells you what importance the Soviet regime ascribed to chess and its transmission and as a cultural weapon, if you will. Taimanov was one of his early pupils. Taimanov would obviously go on to a successful chess career, though he never quite made it to the very top, but certainly a top 10 player for many, many years. Taimanov was a student of his, and then later on we all know about Kasparov and Kramnik and Shirov, and I'll get to all of them later. But so he started teaching chess about this time, but obviously that was interrupted by the war. In the Soviet School of Chess, I asked, is it valid to say that there is a Soviet School of Chess? Well, Botvinnik himself thought there was. He thought that they approached chess differently in the Soviet Union, and I think that that's accurate. Also, right before the outbreak of the war, there was another Soviet championship. Botvinnik didn't participate, but, he did participate, he didn't win. So what happened is he pulled some strings, and he said, oh, you know what, Lilienthal and Bondarevsky, they tied. There should be a playoff. But instead of just the two of them having a playoff, we should have the top six. Conveniently, he's in that top six. And the Soviet officials are like, yeah, we should do that. And then he wins. After that, he not only imposed and he won handily, 2.5 points is pretty huge. Not only, and you notice that Lilienthal and Bondarevsky, the guys who finished at the top, they were at the very bottom in the absolute championship. Well, you can imagine they were probably pretty destroyed by that turn of events. After this, nobody doubted Botvinnik's chess superiority or his political maneuvering, perhaps most importantly. So, outbreak of the war, I talked about the siege of Leningrad in 1941. I talked about how Karpov's dad died, transporting goods across Lake Ladoga. There were other people that died in the evacuation or in the resulting siege. Botvinnik he volunteered for the military, but he was refused because of his eyesight. So instead, his contribution to the Soviet Union's war effort was his dad. His dad, I mentioned, was a dental technician, and part of his dad's job was to collect gold for fillings. And when his dad left the family, he didn't leave him much money, but he left him a little over a pound of gold. And the mom actually just hid it. Botvinnik's mom just hid it, and they never used it, never sold it. They really could have used the money, but they didn't. Well, in 1942, he donated that money to the Soviet war effort. So he contributed as best he could, and then he was evacuated. Actually, he wasn't evacuated. His wife was evacuated, and as a member of the Kirov Ballet, and they were offered to be resettled in the town that's currently called Perm, but at the time it was called Molotov, and we'll get to that in a moment. So he was evacuated, and so he accompanied his wife and his daughter Olga, and they got way away from the advancing line, and they actually got out just in the nick of time. They got out on August 19th. On August 21st, the Nazis severed rail connections to St. Petersburg, completely encircling the town. After that, the only way out was by truck or by boat across the lake, if it were frozen or if it were thawed. But that was really sketchy because all that time you had German artillery landing on the shelf of the lake and busting it open, and trucks sinking down to the bottom, and that's how Korchnoi dad died. So they got out just in the nick of time, and Botvinnik was hired to work in a factory, a high voltage factory. So they're generating electrification. Obviously, this is part of his expertise. But while he was there, he did get a special dispensation as the Soviet champion to have 3 days off per week instead of 1 day off per week, which he used to study. But those were still lean times. Food was somewhat scarce. Botvinnik had to do things that he normally didn't have to do, chop his own firewood, that sort of thing. And despite all this, Botvinnik is still trying to arrange a match for the World Championship, although not with Alekhine. Anybody know who he was trying to arrange a match with? Remember, Alekhine is persona non grata, again, because he collaborated with the Nazis. He played in their tournaments, he wrote anti-Jewish articles and papers, later denied that he wrote it, but anyway.
Capablanca.
Not Capablanca. Capablanca, I think, was either dead or in very poor health by this time. Sammy Reshevsky. The Americans hated Alekhine because they hated the Nazis. The Russians hated the Nazis because they broke the non-aggression pact and invaded Russia. So, they're enemies. Alekhine's your enemy. He's our enemy. Let's play, and we'll just declare the winner the world champion. Well, you can imagine the logistics of playing a world championship match during World War II was kind of hard. So that never actually materialized, but it was attempted, at least. Now, I said he was relocated to the town of Molotov. You probably heard that name before because of Molotov cocktails, right? Well, you may know Molotov was also the foreign minister who negotiated with the foreign minister of Germany, von Ribbentrop, to sign a non-aggression pact, which Nazi Germany then violated, invading Russia in Operation Barbarossa. He was also the premier for a while, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Does anybody know where Molotov cocktails come from? It's actually a pretty funny story. So Molotov was the premier, and part of his job was like Minister of Propaganda. I mentioned earlier that the Soviet Union invaded Finland in 1939, the Winter War, and they seized territory around St. Petersburg, north of St. Petersburg, including where Botvinnik was born, so that they could better protect their important town of St. Petersburg against Nazi Germany. Well, the Soviet Union fought a war with Finland, and Finland actually surprisingly put up a firm resistance. You may have heard of the sniper called the White Death, the Finnish sniper who shot like 500 Russians, something like that. That was during that war, but mostly the Soviet Union had a hard time against the Finns, even though they had so many more tanks and so many more troops, because they'd purged most of their officers, and their officers that were remaining were inexperienced. Wow. They did win, but they were kicked out of the League of Nations, and Molotov tried to keep them from being ejected from the League of Nations and try to protect their international reputation by saying that they weren't dropping bombs on the Finns. Oh no, they were dropping food. That was humanitarian aid, because the Finns, they were starving. Those weren't bombs, right? No, they were bombs. The Finns called them, they called the bombs Molotov bread baskets, as a little funny euphemism for them. And then the Finns devised, and they didn't invent it, but they devised the improvised incendiary device, a glass bottle full of flammable liquid lit by some sort of handmade fuse, and they were used to attack Russian tanks. And they called them Molotov cocktails, because you needed a drink to go with the bread baskets. Yeah. So that was the Finns fighting their little war of propaganda against it. But Molotov I mentioned because he was a big-time ally of Botvinnik. He was a big supporter of Botvinnik for not just before the war, but during and after the war. And whenever Botvinnik needed something, he pretty much called Molotov. And Botvinnik didn't seem to communicate much with Stalin directly, but Stalin was also a big supporter of Botvinnik. And basically what Botvinnik asked for, if it actually made it all the way up to Stalin, Stalin would approve it. But most of the time he could just call Molotov, and Molotov would handle it. So Molotov was considered like a hero of the Soviet Union, at least during the war, and that's why they renamed the town Perm to Molotov. But then after Khrushchev came, they realized they admitted some of the things that they did that were wrong, and they changed the name back to Perm. He was no longer a hero. So they're trying to arrange a match. They don't know what they're going to do. The war, is finally over, but they have no way of really arranging a match against Alekhine. But they tried. In February 4th, 1946, Botvinnik formally issued a challenge to Alexander Alekhine, who was living in exile in Portugal. Tried to make it over to the United States during the war, but the U.S. refused his visa, and he wasn't welcome in France because he was a Nazi collaborator. He wasn't welcome in Spain because, Spain had their civil war. And so he goes even further. He goes to the end of Europe to Portugal. And he's living in exile there. And they wanted to organize a world championship through the British Chess Association, or the British Chess Federation. So they arranged terms. And on March 23rd, 1946, the British Chess Federation sends a telegram to Alekhine with the terms that have been agreed upon by both parties, and they're going to start talking about logistics. Next day, Alekhine dies. I talked in the Alekhine lecture about whether it was a suspicious circumstance or not. Obviously, his health was failing. But one thing that's really interesting is that Botvinnik got a call at home to say, quote, terrible news, Alekhine died unexpectedly 3 hours ago. How did they know that? As Portugal and Soviet Union, I mean, there's no Twitter, right? You know, so you can't just text, hey, guess who died? You know, I mean, telegrams obviously are pretty quick, but how do you, anyway. So conspiracy theorists have had fun with that one. I don't want to speculate one way or the other. But Alekhine dies, now there's a big void. How are we going to fill it? Well, we did have a couple of tournaments after World War II. The biggest one was Groningen in 1946. And there were some big names there. Max Owe, Smyslov, in kind of his international tournament debut. Najdorf, we've heard of, right? Boleslavskis, Floor, goes to Stoltz. Dinker is there, Kotov. I mean, big names, right? The only major name that's missing would be Bogolyubov, who was not welcome because of his Nazi affiliations during the war. And Botvinnik wins that tournament by half a point. So he comes out of the war. A war, incidentally, where he did play a few tournaments in Russia, but his form wasn't all that great. And we can imagine he was a busy guy. Also neglected to mention that in 1943, Botvinnik moved to Moscow, where he would live for the rest of his life. So he went from Leningrad, whose chess scene was just ravaged by the war, to Moscow, which was protected because it didn't have Nazis encamped 3 miles away, bombarding them every day. So Botvinnik wins. Incidentally, Botvinnik had a clear path to victory. Well, he thought he kind of talked himself out of it. Najdorf came up to Botvinnik the night before the last round, and he said, hey, how about we just draw our last game? This happened a lot back then. Maybe it happens today. We don't talk about it. I don't really know. But it happened a lot back then. They'd have grandmaster draws where they literally agreed the night before that they were just going to play 18 moves and draw. Well, Botvinnik declined because he was tied with Owa, but Owa was against Kotov, and Kotov was going to go for a win, and he thought Kotov might lose, or he was half a point ahead, and he decided to refuse Najdorf's offer because he didn't know that having that half a point, which would put him 1 point up with 1 round to go, he wanted to win first single by himself, so he didn't want to risk that, so he refused. Well, he lost against Najdorf, but then Owa lost against his opponent, Kotov. Kotov upset him in the last round. Botvinnik owed him a drink, I'm sure. And so he ended up winning by half a point. Now, that was important. If Owa would have won this tournament, people might have said, oh, well, let's just make Owa the champion. He was the last guy before Alekhine. So he won a prestigious international tournament. Let's just declare him champion. But when Botvinnik won, they couldn't do that. So it was important for him to win that tournament. There were some strong political implications. I want to tell you a little bit about Botvinnik's paranoia because he's doing a lot of tournament preparation during this time and he's working with people. But it was shrouded in secrecy. Here's what would happen. You're a chess master in the Soviet Union. You get a call, not from Botvinnik, from someone else who says, hey, Botvinnik wants to train with you. You can't really refuse because he's favored by lots of people. But you also knew that you couldn't backstab Botvinnik in any way, shape, or form. Like, it's basically a non-disclosure agreement automatically when you agree to work with them. You didn't tell anybody. Anything that you found in training, that was his to use as he saw fit. And if you ever did anything to annoy him, you were gone. Not purged, not that bad. This is after the war. They're not doing that as much anymore, not nearly as much. But you were banished, and Botvinnik was never really going to speak with you again, which was going to be costly politically. So that was a tough situation to be put in. Okay, what was agreed is that they would settle the World Championship by a tournament. They would take the top 6 people, although it was only 5 because Ruben Fine declined to attend. He prioritized his career, supposedly, at this point. And they took the top 5 people, and they had a very long, you see, they played each other 5 times. And at the end, Botvinnik won by clear 3 points. And the top 3 finishers were all Soviets. So this is, and he's declared world champion at this point. This is a major win for the Soviet Union. Incidentally, were the Soviet players told, were they given directives, maybe? Well, I want to read you an excerpt. This comes from, the scholarship in this book is outstanding. Okay, here is Botvinnik speaking in an interview in 1991. So the tournament was originally, they moved towns and they moved to Moscow for the second half. And when they did, quote, something unpleasant happened. At a very high level, it was proposed that the other Soviet players would lose to me on purpose. It was Stalin personally who proposed this. Of course I refused. It was an intrigue against me to belittle me, a ridiculous proposal made only to put down the future world champion. Now, you get a feel for Botvinnik's personality there, who says, no, you don't have to intentionally lose to me, you're going to lose anyway, sort of thing. You get the idea of that bluster, that's important. But you also get this concept that Soviet players were expected to toe the line at times. It's going to come up again later. So Botvinnik is world champion, and now FIDE is starting to organize the world championship cycle. And in 1950, they have a candidates tournament. In that candidates tournament, Bronstein and Boleslavsky tie, so they go to a playoff. In that playoff, they tie, so they go to a tiebreaker. And Bronstein wins the last game and therefore earns the right to challenge Botvinnik for the championship. So in 1951, we have Bronstein versus Botvinnik. It's a draw. Botvinnik retains the title. And there's some fireworks back and forth. You see Bronstein made it interesting by winning games 21 and 22, but then Botvinnik, actually in game 23, true story, Bronstein was going for a knockout blow, and he was playing for a win, and he lost. And then they quickly drew the last game, and Botvinnik retained his title. After 1950, or from 1948 to 1951, Botvinnik didn't really play much. He was actually building a house in a prestigious little suburb of Moscow, a little north of the Moscow River. Actually, he pulled some strings to get that land, and then he built it with logs that he himself, like he built his own. It's a very romantic tale. You can look it up. In 1951, after this match, he kind of stops playing again because he defends his doctoral dissertation. Obviously, his education plans are put on hold by the war. After the war, he resumes his PhD program, and he gets his PhD in electrical engineering in June 28th, 1951. It's ironic because later on he would criticize Fischer. After Fischer won the championship in 73 and then stopped playing, Botvinnik criticized him for not playing in any tournaments, which is ironic because Botvinnik had done the exact same thing after he won the world championship. Anyway, Lasker, I mean, there's so many other players who did the same thing. Win the world championship, and then you have nothing to gain and everything to lose by playing in all these tournaments, so they just didn't. Next match was against Smyslov. Smyslov won the candidate cycle in 1953. They played in 1954. That match was also drawn 12-12. I'd like to point out that at this point, Kasparov said that Botvinnik was one of the greatest match players of all time. I don't often disagree with Garry Kasparov, but I would like to point out that at this point, Botvinnik hasn't won a match since 1940. Think about that. He's drawn matches, he's won tournaments, but he's not won a match since 1940. And that streak actually continues a little bit longer. Okay, let's go to our fifth and last game of the day. It's one of the last games Botvinnik played, at least rated. I'll turn that over to Warren.
So, one of Botvinnik's biggest contributions to chess was in the English opening, and specifically in what is known today as the Botvinnik system. It's an opening system for white and for black, by the way. You can even play it as black against certain openings. And it's a certain pawn structure and arrangement of pieces that he really had a huge influence on. So the point behind this opening is you establish your pawns as white as on c4 and e4, and this really gives you firm control over d5. So the game usually takes on a more closed character. Now, the downside of this opening is pretty obvious. You weaken the d4 square permanently, right? You're never going to be able to recover that square with a pawn again. But the upside of the Botvinnik system is it's very flexible. You can play on either the king side or the queen side with this opening, partly because you have space on both sides of the board since you've played c4 and e4. The other nice thing is you really only have one bad piece usually, and that's your bishop on g2. And that often plays a role later on if you take on f5, if black makes that break, or just protecting your king. So it's often useful in its own right. So despite the weakness of the d4 square, there's a lot of positives, and Botvinnik showed that these really do outweigh the negatives here. And by the way, you can really see his influence on Kasparov because Kasparov also played the Botvinnik system throughout his career too. So one thing about the Botvinnik system is that even though the d4 square is weakened, most of the time white can simply capture a knight that happens to arrive on that square. So it's not even a decisive weakness anyway. Now, one instructive thing to keep in mind in the Botvinnik system is that f4 can be a break a lot of times, but you want to be careful when you play it because f4 can help black activate his dark squared bishop. So white can forego playing f4 by controlling f4 with his pieces instead. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces controlling that square, so white prevents black from advancing f4 himself. So that's important to keep in mind. So black tried to capture on d4 and ease his crampedness there, but it didn't work out very well. And white has this really excellent position, but only here did Botvinnik really go astray. White has a couple good options here. One of them is just bishop f4. This move not only threatens d6, but it puts pressure on the center. So after queen d8, white can play a rook e1, and black isn't immediately lost, but white has a lot of nice ideas in connecting with e5, possibly queen a5, hitting a couple pawns. Well, white has some really active ideas here. Alternatively, white could just play rook c2, followed by rook fc1, and just pile up on the c file, and that would give white a lot of activity too. But Botvinnik decided to play bishop h6, but this consolidation didn't help him out. And after bishop e5, Spassky was okay. And they shortly agreed to a draw here. And after rook b4, Botvinnik accepted a draw offer. But the important thing is his contribution and influence on developing the opening. There's a great series of books on the English by Mikhail Marin in the Grandmaster Repertoire series, and there are so many Botvinnik games he quotes in that book. You can really tell the influence he had there. The games are always Kasparov or Botvinnik, it seems like. But by the way, it wasn't just the English opening that Botvinnik had influence. By the way. Like we mentioned earlier, how he influenced Shirov on the white side, he also has a system as black named after him, the Botvinnik variation. So in the semi-Slav defense, after e6, bishop g5, d takes c4 was his invention. And it was extremely sharp, and he was known for studying, as you know. So he did very well. He had excellent results with his opening as black. And it bears his name today because of his games and analysis. So his influence on the opening of chess was really far-reaching. He really touched the game.
As you know, Botvinnik retained his title against Smyslov, but then in the next cycle, Smyslov won the candidates tournament, and then Smyslov defeated Botvinnik to take the World Chess Championship in 1957. Under guidelines that FIDE had implemented that actually Botvinnik had proposed, the unseeded champion would have the right of return match. So that return match occurred without a candidate cycle in 1958, and Botvinnik won that to regain his title. So Smyslov was actually the world chess champion, I think, for a year and 3 days, something like that. Now, here's something that you may not know about Botvinnik. He was a firm believer in maneuvering. We've covered that. But he was a firm believer in manipulating his opponents. So let me give you a couple of tactics out of Botvinnik's playbook. First, Botvinnik often knew about tournaments and matches before his opponents. Now, when he was involved in tournaments in the Soviet Union, like that absolute championship, he knew about it like a month before any of the other players were told about it. So he had like a month and a half to prepare. The other players had 3 weeks. They were just told, be in Moscow in 3 weeks. You know, you're going to have a tournament. They had to go. And Botvinnik knew about it well in advance because he had orchestrated it. So he had time to prepare against all of his opponents. That's one reason why maybe he did so well in that tournament. Well, the right of the rematch, it's not an automatic thing. You have to ask for it. Smyslov didn't know if Botvinnik was going to ask for a rematch. Botvinnik knew. He said he didn't. He said he took 2 months to decide this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, it was his choice whether or not to have a rematch, which meant maybe if Smyslov was really diligent, he could have used that time to study and prepare, but maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But Botvinnik certainly did before he announced that, yes, I want to exercise my right to a rematch. And then they had it, and he won. So that's one tactic from his playbook. The other thing is he was notorious for wanting to change match conditions right before the match. So he would propose changes to rules or venue this or, talk about, smoking or light or something like this. Sounds like Fischer, really. But, or the fact that when they adjourned, they had to seal their moves in 2 different envelopes. One would go to the arbiter and the other would go to their second, so that there could be no accusation of the arbiter not unsealing the correct move because there was this verification. But it would also force the person to write their move twice, to put it in 2 different envelopes. And that takes time, and oftentimes you adjourn and you have a time pressure right there, and if you have like 10 seconds on your clock and you got to write and scribble and put it in the, So this was also a little psychological thing. And there was one match, I think it was with Smyslov, the first time, they argued for a month just over the idea of the second envelope. So that was one of his other weapons, was this introducing rules at the last minute to try to aggravate his opponent. And that also psyched him up, because if they can get in an argument and he can start really not liking that person, then he could get himself worked up and motivated. Incidentally, it's been reported that Smyslov was kind of preferred to Botvinnik as a champion because of his background. He was unquestionably Russian, whereas Botvinnik is still regarded as Jewish. And Smyslov, being younger, was kind of the regime's golden boy, or maybe I should say ginger boy, because he's a redhead. And in their eyes, he was the kind of the future. But Botvinnik took his title back in actually surprising fashion. If you look, he won the first 3 games, 2 of them as black. Do you know how he caught Smyslov off guard? Botvinnik, incidentally, was primarily he played the French defense a lot. Do you know what he played in this?
Played the Caro-Kann.
He played the Caro-Kann. He played the Caro-Kann both times in games 1 and 3 and won them both. Caught Smyslov very off guard. So his opening prep had served him well. The next candidate cycle, Mikhail Tal wins the candidate cycle, and in their match, he defeats Botvinnik pretty soundly. I told you in the Tal lecture that an 11-year-old Mikhail Tal had once gone to where Botvinnik was staying in Riga, Latvia, on vacation after winning the World Championship, and knocked on his door, and he had his chess set with him, and he wanted to play the World Champion, and he said, and his Botvinnik's wife answered and said, no, he's napping, can't play right now. And Mikhail Tal was like, well, how can you be world champion if he hasn't beaten me? Anyway, he looked up to Botvinnik, but he finally got his chance all those years later in the 1960 World Chess Championship, and he stunned Botvinnik. Botvinnik wasn't comfortable with Tal's style. That's not surprising. Tal, is brilliant. And understand that Tal's strength was calculation, right? Botvinnik is getting weaker and weaker at calculation. He's getting older. we know from those of us in this room that you can supplement calculation with memory. You know, you can learn openings better, you can learn end games better, but as you get older, your ability to calculate suffers somewhat. And Botvinnik got out calculated in this match. So Botvinnik again exercises his right to a return match. Tal wasn't sure. Is he going to exercise the right to a return match? And Botvinnik did. And he won. By a lot, actually. It was the most dominant match result that had been in the World Chess Championship since Alekhine destroyed Bogolyubov in the late 1920s. Well, why the turnaround? Well, there's a couple reasons. First, Botvinnik worked really, really, really hard. We can't fault him for his work ethic. He worked really, really hard. Second, the day after the tournament ended, the match ended, well, maybe not the day after, but soon after, Botvinnik was back at work studying. Tal was celebrating. I mean, he's Tal. He's celebrating. So Botvinnik came to this match much better prepared, right? And that showed. True story. After his win in game 21, which completely sealed, you know, there was no possible way that Tal could come back, the crowd, in their euphoria, tried to carry Botvinnik out, raised up on their hands, try to, you know, like take him out. And Botvinnik said, quote, no, I'm not a patriarch that you can carry on your hands. That's how he got the nickname. Another thing, true story, a little tidbit. Botvinnik was not very good in long matches. He got tired. His endurance was not that great. Tal's was actually quite good for someone who struggled his whole life with health problems, kidney problems in particular. And Botvinnik also often struggled in long matches, like, you know, the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th game, he'd get worn out. But he discovered a secret in 1960 when he was at a tournament in Leipzig that, according to him, well, he credits as kind of much changing that paradigm and giving him the ability to endure long matches. Do you know what that secret was? Coffee. I mean, we look at that and we go, oh, duh. I've talked to Warren about, you know, coffee and blitz sessions on ICC before, but coffee was a very rare thing in the Soviet Union at this time. But he just discovered it in Leipzig, and then Botvinnik became famous for his ubiquitous thermos. Wherever Botvinnik was, his thermos was there on the table. And his thermos contained a variety of different drinks, sometimes lemonade, sometimes this black currant juice that had fresh squeezed lemonade that his wife prepared for him, and sometimes coffee. And he really credited coffee for giving him the ability to focus for, 5 hours. Okay, moving on. This is the candidates tournament where the Soviets arranged draws against one another in 1962. This was the last candidate cycle that Fischer participated in. And you can see the draw of the Soviet players, with the exception of Tal, who wasn't having it. Bobby Fischer being really removed from contention as a result. Petrosian and Botvinnik played for the World Chess Championship in 1963. Petrosian won pretty handily. Botvinnik really struggled against his style. Petrosian was just going to wear him down. Petrosian, actually something really surprising. He said, you know what? I'm going to beat him in an endgame. Nobody tried to beat Botvinnik in the endgames. Botvinnik contributed to many, many textbooks on the endgames with his wins. He had really interesting ideas about, like, queen and pawn versus queen. And, it was considered a draw, but Botvinnik actually rewrote the rules on that. He was a strong endgame theorist, he really was. And Petrosian beat him in his own game. Played really strong positional chess and then tried to outplay him in the endgames and actually succeeded at it, surprisingly enough. He also had youth on his side. Warren showed you a game from 1970. Botvinnik's last rated tournament was in Leiden in 1970. Botvinnik is 59 years old. And he tied for third. There were only 4 participants, so basically tied for last at this tournament. So that wasn't an extremely strong performance, but he's 59 years old. You gotta give him credit. He was still drawing Boris Spassky, the current world champion, in 1970. That's not something many can claim. After this, he really shifted his focus to other things. We know about his work with computer chess. His Pioneer program, which, as I've mentioned before, never really worked. Botvinnik never really admitted that it didn't work either. He stubbornly stuck with it even when computing shifted the reality out from under his feet. Why? Quite simply because of Moore's law, that the number of transistors that you can fit on a CPU will double roughly every 18 months. And I think that was theorized back in the late 60s, and it held true until, I think it still holds true actually. I think that it's pretty much been every 18 months that the processing power of a CPU is pretty much doubled, which means that before, calculating, just every possible move, that wasn't feasible. But now that's what all the top engines do, right? They can just calculate 3 million, 4 million, 5 million possibilities per second. And all the top grandmasters have supercomputers, right, that they train with and analyze with. Well, that's not the route Botvinnik took. He didn't, he was trying to more focus trying to essentially create an artificial intelligence, which, as we know, still doesn't exist in any comprehensive form, I'll say. And so that approach never really worked, and he stubbornly stuck it out. He was also a coach. We talked about him teaching. Kasparov obviously is his notable protege. In fact, they changed the name of the school to the Botvinnik-Kasparov School, and they continued to teach together there for many, many years. They had a successful collaboration. Essentially, Botvinnik would do the lessons, Kasparov would do simul's. Kasparov at this point is a much stronger simul player than Botvinnik. Kasparov's calculation is legendary. And they had all sorts of students, like Kramnik was obviously a famous student from that school. Botvinnik kept it up. His longevity is legendary. He kept it up till early 1995. He died in 1995 of an untreatable form of cancer. But he lived all the way through the fall of the Soviet Union. That was kind of a tough time for him because he's, remained a convinced communist for the remainder of his life. But even 2 months before he died, even when he was blind in one eye, he was still going to school every day and teaching. So he certainly had this passion, this commitment for chess. And whether we look at his legacy as a player, as an organizer, because he was there at the real foundation of FIDE, whether we look at it as a engineer and computer programmer, or whether it's a teacher, really all those things together, I mean, we do have to substantiate those comments on YouTube that you really got to cover Botvinnik. So for the presentation, we used a lot of the same sources as the Soviet School of Chess. Warren used the On My Great Predecessor series by Kasparov, which we highly recommend. Kotov, who was a frequent rival of Botvinnik and had trained with him, knew him personally, wrote the Soviet School of Chess. Andy Soltis, obviously the book I showed you earlier, as well as his Soviet chess book that was also published by McFarland. And finally, Jenna Sasanko, who also knew Botvinnik and had many conversations and played with him. So that's what we used, and as always, if you have any questions, we'll try our best to answer them.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.